moderator, Sunita Sarabji.
Thank you, Sandy. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to see you all again after the Thanksgiving holiday. We start today's call with Dr. Ravi Chandra, a psychiatrist here in the San Francisco Bay Area, who will talk to us, attempt to explain why it is that abusers abuse. And Dr. Chandra, in our pre-brief, you mentioned that it is not only men who abuse, and so I would like to say that as well. Dr. Chandra.
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to go at a bit of a different angle and read my statement, but I think the question is broader than why do men become abusive. But we live in a culture of abusive power, where abusive power is given far too much license and is yet hidden in the shadows. So as you mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist, writer, and compassion educator in San Francisco, and my most pertinent current writing is for Eastwind E-Zine, where I am writing from my corner of the intersection of Black and Asian lives in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and so many others. The Black Plague of the 14th century was thought to be caused by a miasma of noxious vapors. And the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and surfacing racial trauma have an underlying aggravating cause: the miasma of narcissistic, self-centered, tribalistic personality and culture. We can no longer think we can stave off the effects of this miasma with sweet and superficial flowers held to our nose as we carry on business as usual. President Trump is an extraordinary example of individualistic, antagonistic, aggressive, self-centered, masculine power, and my personal opinion is that he is an abused child who has grown up to abuse others, a clearly misogynistic and racist leader who has been accused of inappropriate behavior and assault, including rape, by over 24 women. He has used his power and influence to avoid the justice system. It should give us great pause that 72 million people voted for him, a clear indicator that abuse can get a bye, a wink, and a nod from all too many of us. This is not surprising for those of us who come from households where family members looked the other way or denied abuse by a parent, spouse, or caregiver. We are all affected by a culture that deems money and power, especially masculine power, as more important than relationship and compassion. Indeed, compassion and common humanity become the bad objects of a culture of abusive power. Compassion and common humanity have been subordinated and under assault for the last 5 years. For the last 5 years, we have all had a taste of what it's like to live and even be incarcerated in an abusive household, and how difficult it is to fight our way out. It takes a massive collective effort, and perhaps it finally took COVID-19 and 250,000 plus deaths to magnify and make clear the effects of self-centered delusion. What we have witnessed in the last 9 months is a macrocosm of what an abuse victim experiences psychologically: devaluing, bullying, threats, intimidation, coercion, gaslighting, dehumanization, subordination, calls for violence, and more, all the while held in place by an entire system devoted to the abusive leader. And there are plenty of people, particularly those in marginalized communities, who have felt the abuser's hand very directly in their lives. School bullying has reportedly increased under President Trump. The Trump DOJ narrowed the definition of domestic violence to only physical aggression in 2019, ruling out psychological aggression. The Trump administration has not reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act, which had been partially credited for a 60% drop in reports of intimate partner violence from 1996 to 2010. This was out of their wish to uphold gun purchase rights for those convicted of acts of domestic violence who were no longer with that partner. Yet guns are a risk factor for intimate partner homicide. I might suggest the answer to getting out of our abusive family quagmire of extreme, antagonistic, tribalistic individualism is not divorce, but diverse. We have to become more related and consciously interdependent as a culture, embracing the strengths and challenges of our diverse society, which will only become more diverse in the years to come. COVID-19 has been a stressor, a destroyer, and a growth challenge. The hidden pandemic of intimate partner violence has been exacerbated. Reports on calls to hotlines are mixed. There are reports of increased calls and others reporting a 50% drop, likely due to the difficulty of making private calls during isolation. And it's hard to find substantial data on actual violence, but experts are expecting a significant increase in IPV and homicide because disasters in the past have exacerbated violence, and COVID underscores risk factors for domestic violence. Moreover, these risk factors are much worse for marginalized communities, so outcomes for domestic violence will likely be worse for minority communities, just as outcomes for other physical and mental health challenges are worse in the BIPOC communities. Isolation increases opportunity for psychological aggression, control, and coercion. Financial stresses are a known risk factor for domestic violence. Psychological stress is also a risk factor for domestic violence. There was an uptick in IPV during Hurricane Harvey, for example. 1 in 3 women and, as mentioned, 1 in 10 men experience spousal abuse in their lifetime, and IPV cuts across all ethnic categories. I won't get into statistics of IPV in the Asian community because
I think I'll talk about 3 main points. The first is what DV victims with criminal cases against their perpetrators can expect from the criminal courts and the DA's office during the current shelter-in-place order. The second is resources available from our office to support DV victims during shelter-in-place. And then finally, how DV victims can seek protection through criminal protective orders. We know it can be so hard for DV victims to seek help, and there are additional barriers in our immigrant communities. So what I hope is that this information will demystify the criminal process, as well as relevant COVID-19 restrictions for DV victims if they are seeking help. First, I want to remind everyone that the first step for the criminal process to be triggered is when the police is called. It's oftentimes by the DV victim, but sometimes by a witness like a neighbor to a DV incident. Even in the midst of shelter in place, as Sunita mentioned, victims are still able to call the police to seek help, and criminal cases are still being filed and heard in criminal court. And that's because the police, the DA's office, and criminal courts are essential services that have been allowed to remain open. And that's been true here in Santa Clara County. Our criminal courts handling family violence cases have been open every day during shelter in place. Some types of hearings were initially delayed during the first few months of shutdown, including jury trials. Now, these were hearings that involved coordinating with more people like victims and witnesses. However, even these hearings have since resumed their pre-pandemic pace here in Santa Clara County. Note, though, that court functions do look different now than they did prior to shelter in place, and they've changed depending on how restrictive the public health orders have been in response to the rising COVID-19 numbers in our community. So, for example, this week, in response to the surge in COVID-19 cases in our county, our Superior Court issued a new order that restricts the number of people or the types of parties that are allowed to even come into the courthouse. So for criminal court, the defendants, as well as the attorneys on both sides, and only witnesses and victims, including DV victims, that have been subpoenaed for court, and that's the court order that requires them to show up for court. Their victim advocates can come as well as parents of minor victims may also appear. If DV victims go to court under subpoena, the same COVID-19 restrictions that you see elsewhere apply, including screening at the front so that you can't enter if you have COVID-19 symptoms, have to wear a mask, and practice social distancing. So for other hearings, the victims and the public at large may not attend in person. However, some courts, including here in Santa Clara County, have created options for victims to appear remotely if they aren't able to appear in person. The first is through video calls in the same way that we're doing here through Zooms or through Microsoft Teams. Courts are allowing victims to appear via the remote link. So for example, if the victim wants to provide input about the type of protective order that they want the court to issue, or if the victim wants to speak at the defendant's sentencing and tell the court about what he or she thinks should happen to the case, then they can do so via these remote links. The other option is through telephone, and that's through, here in Santa Clara County, we have public access telephone lines. Every court department has a number that the victim or the public can call into if they just want to listen into the proceedings in the same way in the past if you would just come to court and sit in the gallery and observe. Prosecutors and victim advocates from our DA's office Victim Services Unit have continued to be in touch with victims, meeting in person as needed and following all safety protocols, including mask and social distancing, and though we've also shifted to meeting virtually as well. Our Victim Services Unit is essentially a crime victim's connection to prosecutor, law enforcement, and our advocates also help victims have a voice in the criminal justice process because we know it can be very intimidating. Victim advocates can assist DV victims with applying for reimbursement for medical expenses and counseling, emergency assistance like finding emergency shelter, crisis support, and safety planning. Here in Santa Clara County, our DA's office Victim Services Unit have multiple language capabilities. In addition to English, we have Spanish, Vietnamese, Mandarin Chinese, and Russian speaking capabilities. We also have access to the language access line where a third-party service provider assists over the phone for other languages that we don't have sort of direct support for. I was also asked to talk a bit about criminal restraining orders and how victims can avail themselves to them during the pandemic. And there are two types that are triggered by the criminal process. The first is an emergency protective order. They're generally available once the police are called and when the officer or the victim believes the victim is in immediate or present danger of domestic violence. It's in effect for a very limited period of time and then they expire. Essentially, an officer makes an application based on his investigation, and that includes talking to the victim and collecting any corroborating evidence. The second type is criminal protective orders, and these are issued by the court hearing a DV criminal case. So there's two types of criminal protective orders: no contact order and peaceful contact order. And pretty self-explanatory there, but with no contact, you can't have any direct or indirect contact with the victim. And then peaceful contact must be peaceful contact, cannot molest, strike, threaten, stalk, sexually assault, batter, harass, or in any way disturb the peace. So that includes verbally assaulting the victim. The court does take into account the victim's input for the criminal protective order. And again, the victim may provide input by making a statement to the court at the time the court issues the protective order. Generally, the victim's oral statement to the court is sufficient, but the court may review any additional evidence. The court may review the police report, hear input from the DA, who may discuss any prior DV that he or she is aware of, as well as the defendant's violent history, and also take input from the defense attorney as well. A few final points as a general matter, whether here in Santa Clara County or elsewhere. If you are a victim of DV, seek help. If not from the police, because again, we know it can be a very intimidating process, reach out to a DV service provider to seek that help, right? But let's say a criminal case is filed, I encourage DV victims to just be in close touch with the DA on the case, as well as the victim advocate, right? Again, the criminal justice system can be really difficult to navigate for anyone, and it's even more difficult now in the time of changing COVID-19 restrictions, right? When you can go to court, when you cannot. So you don't have to do it all alone. You don't have to know it all. Just be in touch with your victim advocate or your DA. They'll keep you apprised of the changing restrictions. And finally, we know that DV victims may also require immigration and legal services for immigration and family legal services in addition to their criminal case. Then in that case, I encourage victims to seek out family justice centers in your jurisdiction, which are one-stop shops for DV victims to access those holistic services in one location. We have two here in Santa Clara County that are currently open for in-person services in San Jose and Morgan Hill, and I'll send that info to everyone in the chat.